Hi everyone, and welcome to our second webinar in our short series about restoring invaded sites. My name's Claire Ryan. I'm the coordinator of the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, and I'll be your moderator for today. So just in case you're not familiar with us, the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, or MIPN, is a regional network composed of diverse stakeholders with interest in invasive plants. These stakeholders make up both our membership and our board of directors, and include researchers and educators, state agencies, representatives of the horticulture, nursery, and landscape industries, and land managers. Our mission as an organization is to reduce impacts of invasive species in the Midwest, which is simply stated, but certainly not easy to accomplish. The map on the right shows our primary geographic area of focus. The purple dots are the locations of MIPN's current board of directors, and the red star is our headquarters, is just a little bit west of Chicago. We aim to accomplish our mission by synthesizing and sharing information, and by developing resources and publications. For example, MIPN has developed a database of invasive plant-specific control methods and a regional invasive plant list, which was compiled from our individual state lists, and also resources for gardeners and landscapers. All of that and more is available on our website, which is on the screen now, www.mipn.org. We're supported by a network of contributing members. Now is a great time to become a member. Our 2018 membership drive is just wrapping up here, so our memberships are contiguous with the calendar year. There are some great benefits of joining, including conference and publication discounts. If you'd like to learn more about that, just visit mipn.org/join. We also have quite a large listserv, which you can join regardless if you're a member of MIPN or not. If you'd like to do that, just send an email with your basic contact information to the address on the screen. I do want to take just a moment to thank and acknowledge our partners. The United States Forest Service Northeastern Region is our primary funding partner for this webinar series, so thank you very much to them. Thank you to University of Wisconsin-Madison, particularly Dr. Mark Renz's lab in agronomy, for allowing us the use of the Adobe Connect service. And finally, I want to acknowledge our partner, the Morton Arboretum, which provides MIPN's office space and associated amenities. I mentioned right at the start that this webinar is part of a series. I wanted to give you an idea of the other topics we have coming up. Our next webinar will be on the long-term efforts to regenerate oak species in a remnant forest system here at the Morton Arboretum. That will be on February 27th. And the fourth webinar will be on using MIPN's restoration database to help develop management strategies for a variety of invasive plants. And that'll be on March 20th. Registration for the forest webinar will open later today, so stay tuned on our website or via the listserv for more information and the link to register. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Roger Becker from the University of Minnesota. Roger is a state extension agronomist and weed scientist. He researches and implements weed management strategies in annual and perennial systems and disturbed and undisturbed habitats. In addition to his work with Canada thistle in prairie settings, which he'll be going into today, he also studies purple loosestrife in wetlands, garlic mustard and buckthorn in woodlands, weed management in forage, vegetable processing systems, and the environmental impacts of various weed management systems. So I will be handing it over to Roger right now.
And I want to thank MIPN and Mark Renz and the MIPN board members for making these webinars possible. This is a great way to get some information out. I am an extension specialist, so I do very applied work. And one of those things was Canada thistle, and it so happens it's a big deal in a lot of our cropping systems and forages, and we have a lot of prairie renovations going on in Minnesota, and I got involved through those via my working with the DNR folks and others in fish and wildlife and so forth. And hopefully my computer doesn't crash, but why Canada thistle? Canada thistle is a biggie. It's kind of universal in the northern part of North America, actually the northern hemisphere. rumor has it, if any of you have gone to the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., there's this portrait of General Burgoyne surrendering to our forces. And rumor has it, and it's in some literature, that Canada Thistle probably came over with all the hay they brought for the British military forces. So I have a little picture here of Burgoyne handing over some Canada Thistle instead of his sword. But it's been around a long time in North America, and it probably wasn't just introduced via that pathway, several pathways. In the Midwest, it made its mark getting first on the weed laws of Iowa and Minnesota. And in those days before herbicides and with just tillage practices, it was a serious and economic problem in particularly small grains. And there's a lot of interesting research going over that initial introductions and moving through the Midwest. In Minnesota, it was our first weed on our noxious weed law list. And it's still very political, very charged, and something that gets all sorts of people talking. There's lawsuits, and there's a lot of politics, and intrigue going on there that seems to force some of our management that may not be the best management to make the best impact on Canada Thistle. Canada Thistle is really suited to the prairie habitat. I know it goes through into Ohio and Michigan and Indiana. There's some really good prairies there as well. For us, it just thrives in the dark green area, showing the original tall grass prairie system of the Midwest. And for Minnesota, that prairie system is just what's left are the red dots you see on this map, where it's very fragmented, and a lot of the prairie is just simply not left. The good prairies were plowed up for corn, soybeans, and other cropping systems. Canada Thistle does cycle in these prairies, but it also cycles in our agricultural and roadside right-of-ways, etc. Some of these people, my great-grandparents, were part of this crowd that homesteaded in Iowa and Minnesota. They brought a lot of Canada Thistle with them, probably in their feedstocks and forages, but they also tilled the prairies. And that disturbance, as I have looked at Canada Thistle over the years, it is a perennial, but it tends to thrive in some moderately disturbed systems. Absent disturbance, it doesn't seem to stay in the system very well. And so tilling the prairies obviously caused a lot of problems and just created a situation where Canada Thistle thrived. In Minnesota, we have a lot of efforts to reestablish prairies and trying to create some contiguous pathways for waterfowl and so forth. And in the process, you see what you see here with a lot of Canada Thistle showing up in some of those systems, especially during the early phases of establishment. And there are things missing now in prairie management. We're just starting to get grazing back in the system. Before settlement, there were just huge numbers of bison that helped do grazing and basically keeping the prairies in a resilient state. We're trying to reintroduce some of those grazing systems now in some of the prairie systems. We also tend to be missing the fires at the same frequency and timings that we had in the past. Often policies or labor issues or politics or hazards for roadways and stuff prevent us from using fire the way we could have or would have in the old days. As a weed scientist, I like to show this slide. In 1918, see to get the little arrow up, this bulletin in 1918 came out from my U.S. Department of Agriculture. Being an extension person, I'm part of that group. Eradicate Canada Thistle. And I used to use this in classes where you talk about the challenges to eradication as opposed to management. But as you can tell, we haven't eradicated Canada Thistle despite a lot of heroic efforts over a long period of time. And I'll go through a lot of slides that you can go back to and look at on your own time, because I have more in here than we'll be able to cover in the time slot allowed. We'll give a little background on control options and then get into some of our prairie work that has got me to the title that I put out, Now You See Them, Now You Don't. Biocontrol is something that's always talked about for thistles, and if you know the Rhinocellus conicus for musk thistle, there's issues on non-target effects. For these, for Canada Thistle, some of the potential choices would be the gallfly, Europhyra cardua, and the stem weevil, Hydroplantis latura or Pseudorhynchus latura. You can get most any of these online. And for us in Minnesota, most of these are present, and we were trying to determine if we wanted to actually promote any of these. And before we wanted to do that, we wanted to go back, and we're looking at our native Cirsium. These are the 6 that are native to Minnesota. This one right here, a Hills thistle, is the one that's a species of concern. It's one of the least common, and it's also a listed species in some of the Canadian provinces and other states in the Northeast. We're looking at just the specificity of Latura in particular because it was one that was purported to be the most specific. We planted all these species. We're doing a common gardens. We don't have the work done yet, but the initial findings are in no choice specificity testing where you match the phenologies that it does not look that specific. We are gathering data on the phenology of the various thistles, and this is Canada thistle. Perhaps the other thistles would be separated in phenological rosette stages for the Latura life cycle that it may not be as impactful, but we have to sort all of that out. So still to date, I would say that we don't have a lot of good insect biocontrol options that are known to be truly specific. The Europhora might work. This one has been around a long time. If you've seen a lot of Canada thistle, you've seen this Proscenium probably. The rust is endemic in populations of Canada thistle that have been around a while and has generally been thought of as a failure in trying to use it for biocontrol. However, in 2013, this paper came out and some good work with pathologists looking at this rust plant and speculating and finding some research data to support that we probably weren't looking at the life cycle of the rust in the Canada thistle appropriately to get an infection that would perpetuate itself. So this is starting to perhaps flip and being looked at more closely as a potential control opportunity for the rust. Lastly, I'll say this. You see the Pseudomonas syringae, the pathovar to geese, that has been talked about a lot for biocontrol. We did over a decade of work on this in Minnesota. And this slide shows some of the challenges where you see one plant was killed, but you see all these varying expressions of control with that particular bacteria. This is a bacteria. We did all the work to figure out how to get it into the plant, formulate it, get infection. And when we finally got that all worked out, we found Canada thistle quickly kicked up its host defense mechanisms and deactivated the Chagita toxin in it. So we're not too hopeful on that one being widely useful in controlling Canada thistle. So we don't have really good choices for various reasons for biocontrol. That doesn't mean we've given up on them. But it is a perennial herbaceous plant, and if you've worked with these, they're difficult to control. And the key problem is you got to deplete an aggressive root system that's got a lot of carbohydrate storage that keeps perpetuating the plant. You have to kill the underground as well as the above ground portions. This is colleague Phil Westra at Colorado State. This was an interesting demonstration they did for a field day where they simply planted some rootstock fragments in a big box of soil, and then 1 year later flipped it down, washed off the profile, and you can see the amount of root material that developed in just one season. So a lot of that underground activity, photosynthase, going down to develop an extensive root system with lateral roots, and you have to control that via whatever method you use for an entrenched population, as well as controlling the upper shoot growth. And for that, this is hemp dogbane, which, this was my work in late 70s on this control of hemp dogbane in southern Iowa. But it shows something that repeats for most all herbaceous perennial plants, including Canada thistle. And I use it just to show the carbohydrate flow. And you need to look at this from a management standpoint. This is the percent carbohydrate on a dry weight basis in the rootstocks of a herbaceous perennial plant. And when the plant emerges in the spring, it depletes the carbohydrate level, and its goal is to produce that architecture to develop and collect photosynthate and produce seed. So after flowering, it goes into the work of replenishing that carbohydrate in the rootstock, and it just goes through the same cycle year after year. What does that mean from a management standpoint? No matter what you're going to try to do, if you're going to do a non-herbicidal control, you want to try to get at mowing, clipping, hand roguing, something to disrupt the Canada thistle after you've depleted that rootstock of its carbohydrates as much as possible. And for us in Minnesota, it's this time frame when you get to bud to mid-flower. And that typically would be around the last week of June. When the flowers are developing, we start to get some mature seed around the first week of July. Most of the seed production by the second week of July. So up until that point, you can just wait and do your mechanical kind of control to minimize the number of times you have to do it by going after this stage. For herbicides, they need to translocate to the rootstock, and you want to be when that carbohydrate's going down to the roots and building up in the rootstock. So applications in the fall tend to be the most efficacious. There's some exceptions with the milestone and transline we'll get into, but they work effectively at that bud to flower stage and beyond. So look at these timings, and I won't go into this, but other than to say this is a classic study of the 50s where they did tillage with a duck foot to simply cut off the shoots of Canada thistle. And they did it on a weekly basis, bi-weekly, every 3 weeks, 28 days, 35, 42. The point being, if you look at these numbers on top, those show you the number of operations it took, and the bar on the y-axis, the number of days it took to kill that established perennial rootstock. And this actually matches the diagram we just showed on carbohydrates. And if you're going to do mechanical means of control, cultural means of control, you want to let the rootstock go until that flower stage. And before mature seeds start to show up, you've depleted the rootstock. And then I would suggest every 30 days after that, for the rest of the season, to repeat that operation. And you'll most effectively get rid of it with the fewest operations. Now, if you want to go out every week and start early in the season, you can do 18 events, and you can get a lot of energy expended and feel good about it, but you'll get to the same point by doing a lot fewer, by just looking at that carbohydrate depletion opportunity. For herbicides, the growth regulators work well as a group. Some of the sulfonylureas work, but the best efficacy and consistent control would be from this picolinic group, and particularly chlorpyrrolid and aminopyrrolid, which is transline milestone, are the most efficacious with the least negative unintended consequences compared to Toradon or the newer products, aminocyclopyrrochlor. These are actually in order of development through discovery and patenting and licensing. The most recent would be this product, which was marketed recently, sold to Bayer, marketed previously with DuPont. It's probably too non-specific in my opinion. So we tend to look at these two herbicides for the best control. And we won't go into it, that's not what the talk is about, but you can go back and look at these data slides. The work has been done. This particular trial, a lot of locations, a lot of data points. The milestone at 5 and 7 ounces just consistently gives the best control, matches or exceeds the old Toradon, which has too many non-target issues as well as environmental issues, and is a little better than Transline, the chlorpyrrolid products. Just to note that dicamba and 2,4-D is a little better than dicamba, but those products just aren't that efficacious on Canada thistle over the long haul. And we won't go into it, but you can go back to the talk and look at all the various products. Mark Renz has done this kind of work. A lot of people have done this kind of work just over the years looking at the various products, and it shows why we ended up recommending Milestone for the herbicide of choice. And no matter what you do, whether you're doing, I've mentioned doing multiple tillages, if you're doing herbicides, this is a slide that simply shows control with one application, and then some products we didn't come back the next year and do a second application versus putting a sequential on. Because of that extensive root system, you can't just go out, put herbicide on once, in this case 2007, and then walk away and expect to get good control by 2009. Coming in with sequentials helps pick off some of those stragglers that just, for whatever reasons, did not get herbicide translocated to them. Burning. We've done some burning work, and I guess just for the sake of time, I'll just mention that when we burn, we sometimes see a flesh of Canada thistle, depending on when you burn. This happens to be a dandelion, but there are thistle will show up with this bare ground after a burn, and particularly if you do it at certain times in the spring, you'll get a flesh of seedlings. For the most part, though, with burns, we see this kind of effect where you get a resurgence and extensive growth of the warm season grasses, burned versus not burned. And that growth, for the most part, if the prairie's got good resilience and it's a healthy prairie, good mixtures of species, it tends to outcompete those Canada thistle, and they don't tend to stay in the system with the burn. That's not always the case, but generally speaking, particularly because of grasses, if you burn at a certain time of the year, you get such an expression of the warm season grasses that the thistle just don't stay in there. Sometimes you might have unintended activity or consequences for your desired forbs as well, but for the most part, that has not been an issue. Flip side is I don't consider burning a good control option for if the thistle is up, you generally don't have enough a depletion of that rootstock to really matter if you have a prairie that's got a lot of thistle shoots that are up at the time of being burned. So for the last part of the talk, we'll just cover some work where we're looking at just trying to renovate or control Canada thistle in established prairies, or renovation of established prairies, or new seedings of prairies. And this slide is just the kind of things we've done over the years, from the lengthy first trials that we did down to more recent trials. We started out in 2002-03 with DNR having some problem prairies, shall we say. That there are two prairies that are 7+ years old, and they've consistently had bad Canada thistle problems. There were issues with neighbor farmers complaining, and so they had to do control measures, and the issue just kept cycling. So we came into that trial and did some work at the same time. For the forb species that weren't that prevalent, we did some transplanted forb studies starting in 2002 and 2003. After that, with the same group, we worked with some younger prairies. In the third year of establishment, we went in and did some Canada thistle work with herbicides, primarily because for various reasons they need to go in and do either mowing or herbicides because of issues with neighbors and so forth, and the weed law enforcement in this state. Following that, we went into some even younger prairies at 2 years of age, went in and did some management opportunities. And then lastly, a whole bunch of renovations. We went in with a subset of what we learned from the earlier trials and looked at doing some things right at planting, if you're establishing a prairie from a cropland conversion, or going into some new interseedings, trying to beef up forbs in an existing prairie. And we, at planting, or that fall after they had one growing season for the forbs to establish, or the following June. In a nutshell, we found the forb age does matter. As those of you that work in prairies know that forbs do tend to establish over time to get much more resilient and a better root system established. So a 3 to 7 year old forb can be a lot more resilient than a 1 to 2 year old forb. And we had the transplant studies where we simply put the plants in the ground for the species that were not as common in the prairies, and did treatments at a year later. We went into a sand prairie conversion down along Winona, along the Mississippi River, with Kurt Brownell with the Army Corps, and this is Luann Brooks with Dow AgroSciences. This was an 80-acre sand conversion, and they had this cow vetch and hairy vetch running amok, tangling up the little Blandin turtles that use that area for a nesting site, so they couldn't get to the river. And we did quite a bit of work with Milestone and Transline there. Kufren field days working with Fish and Wildlife on the South Dakota border near Ortonville. A 2-year-old stand. The take home for most of this is the thing that you see most in the prairie, the yellow things that make a prairie so showy are also the species that tend to be the ones less tolerant of using something like Transline or Milestone for control. So for us, it was typically yellow prairie coneflower, or the columnar coneflower, the black-eyed Susans, and the sunflower group that were least tolerant to these products. And we didn't kill them all, so there were some plants that were injured like this the year after application, but they didn't outright die, so they would survive. A yellow prairie coneflower here. This shows a Maximilian Sunflower that was injured. You can see the growth regulator curve in the previous year's stock. but it didn't completely die. It started to reestablish. It often takes the second or third year after application for them to reestablish. So you see these delayed effects where the herbicide will be in the root system of those plants, and it takes some time for them to recover. Some of them are killed. This is a round-headed bush clover. Now, some of the legumes like the vetches, these products were very efficacious on, and to me as a weed scientist, somewhat oddly, the native legumes like desmodium and bush clovers and so forth had some tolerance. The upper part of the plant was killed, but the lower part, you can see the crown where the regrowth kept going there. Can't find my arrow. Back to, this is J.B. Bright from left to right, Darrell Deneke and Mike Mechnig when Mike was still in South Dakota State, and Mary Halstead and Luann Brooks. J.B. was really good at working with the new prairie conversion at Kufrin, where we did a lot of work. This is a slide showing the year after, 1 year after putting on the various herbicide treatments, and you can see the forb density in this 2-year-old prairie stand. It would be 3 years old at the time of this photo, showing the impacts of herbicides the year forward. What does it all mean? We basically got to where we developed these tables of green light, yellow light, red light. Green is a species that has good tolerance. Yellow, moderate tolerance. You'll see some impact on the species. And reds are probably ones that will be taken out of the system. And some of the people that do, like Pheasants Forevers and other we work with, Fish and Wildlife, would do a seeding of tolerant species if they knew they're going into Canada thistle population. One thing we worked on, back to this slide, this is Paul Bockenstead on my left in the picture with Stantec now. He was with Minnesota DNR, Iowa DNR. We did some interesting work at one of those sites with a conversion, just trying to see what is Canada thistle competing with. And I keep having trouble getting my arrow to stay there. Here. In a nutshell, we won't go into all the details, but it looked like the Canada thistle and the native forbs were trading places. If you had more of one, you had less of the other. And the native grasses, the non-native grasses, and other species were just doing their thing. But the two that tended to trade places were the Canada thistle and the forbs. So they seem to be competing for the same niche. And when you got to 20 to 30% Canada thistle cover, you had significant drops in native forb richness and abundance. But in summary, for the BMP conclusions, most of the native forbs were quite tolerant to using these herbicides if you had to go in and do something to disrupt Canada thistle. The ones that do have challenges might not be in the system, especially the year after application. You don't see all that yellow, and it looks very, just looks very green and non-showy, and people do not like the look. If you get in there and look around, though, you'll see these species in particular, the suns, roods, and rats, I call them, the Helianthus, rudbeckias, and retibias. They tend to come back, or they have a seed bank, or they tend to be easier to establish anyway, and they seem to come into the systems. So most natives survive. You'll have the flowering disrupted for a year. They tend to come back. Burns for target. If you're going to burn for the reasons you burn, but don't do it for Canada thistle. Was a take home. And if you're going to spray in June around that flower to bud stage. For us, it's the 3rd or 4th week of June, or in the fall, and both of those work well in the systems. We're going to go through a couple things here. This is just seed are always an issue, and for us, when this papai starts to fly, people come unglued and start calling the weed inspector for this papai's flying over my fence, and this guy's contaminating my field with all this thistle. We did some seed trap work just to get that issue, and in a nutshell, the seed tend to stay put. So for us, this is a slide showing this. This is the target plant. This is only 6 meters from the target plant, and the dominant winds show you the direction of seed flight. And they stay very close, within feet of the plant that produces the seed. Papai, however, can go great distances, and this is a deciduous seed detaches from the papi. Evolutionarily speaking, don't ask me why they do that, but they're not that strongly attached, and it's rare to see seed attached. If you do, it's probably an empty achene that never fertilized and isn't fully developed, so that detachment, the abscission layer, isn't that well developed. So we tend to, you worry about the seed if they're in your area. Oh, a side note is a dioecious plant, the male flowers, female flowers. We won't get into the nuances of them, but you have to have both to have fertile seed. We had to worry about that to make sure the study worked. But for seed, for us, it's more so the controlling the plants in place. Seed dispersal is local. They don't go far. And for Minnesotans, we have it everywhere. So the seed bank is virtually everywhere in the state. So that's not shouldn't be our main focus. You don't want to do heroic activities when the papi start to fly. People will go out and mow, drag the mower around and spread seed to different parts that are hung up on the mower. The only time you'd want to do something on a heroic basis to prevent seed production is if the establishment is a new stand. So we'll finish off the last few minutes just talking about where did the thistle go. This was a study where we're looking at that BMP, the first ones we did at Talcott, at Timberlake and West Graham. They were strip trials where we used pickup sprayers, fairly large plots, and went out there and did various management practices. And this was an attempt, this is one of those problem fields that have been causing problems for a long time. And for they wanted to look at a non-herbicide option of just mow spring and fall. Mow like you would in a pasture agricultural setting to get a good regrowth in the fall, and that's often helped us get better control. Just wait and go out and spot spray when the flowers are up, and you could do a lot less herbicide application, less non-target damage than just broadcasting. They were actually spraying a sub-labeled rate at the Timberlake site for years using 8 ounces of transline. And so we looked at a rate titration of less than labeled rates, the labeled rate of 12 and 16 ounces, and spraying at bud, which would be the recommended. They're trying to get waterfowl production. They don't want tracks out there. So this BMP5 was post-nesting, which is after July 15th, which is not optimal for getting translocation when it's shifting from that assimilate going up or down. And also the seed starting to get produced. But that's not the goal. You're trying to produce, you want nesting birds to survive. So these two, 5 and 6, were trying to delay that and see what the outcome was. And then, of course, just trying to do the management before the prairie even got there. We're not going to talk about these, but if you go back and look at the talk, the next few slides to show how that carbohydrate flow goes in the roots under each of those BMP scenarios during a season. And so that's part of the ways to look at how these might turn out. I only put this in. This is Timberlake. This is a couple years after treatment. It just shows you that, forget about all the herbicides, but that's all those BMPs. But the thing to note is it's about a third native forbs, about a third native grasses, and about a third non-native grasses on this problem child Timberlake site, an older prairie. It's got some brome and understory of bluegrass. There's a lot of thatch piling up. And then the Canada thistle was in this group of non-native forbs. But it's about a third. And between the two sites, the thing that was obvious after a couple of years of doing these treatments, this is Canada thistle shoots per acre. This is the mowing twice. Mowing twice a year probably wasn't enough to deplete the carbohydrates in the root stalks to actually control it. And you broke dormancy and got a lot of new shoots coming up. So we actually got higher numbers of Canada thistle where we did mowing at West Graham. Didn't work that way at Timberlake. And this slide just shows that was regrowth from the, my arrow's gone, oh, there it is, sorry. This just shows that it was regrowth in the fall, much like you see in pasture or forage settings where you do a lot of clipping. You'll get more shoots. Excuse me, you need to do interventions more than just twice a year. We've seen this in other trials as well. With mowing, you often get an increased number of shoots. You might not have a lot more Canada thistle seed produced, or even less seed production, but we have a lot of shoots showing up out there. What we did see is the yellow bars, we're not going to go into all the details, but to take it Suffice to say, the yellow stuff is the transline treatments at the low rate going up to the high rate, and the other management practices, the MOMO and the blue control. We did drop species richness, and if you have those, the roods, rats, and suns, they are going to be less prevalent in the system. So we did see that impact. Again, the yellow bars for species abundance, you see a lower abundance, but there's still quite a mix of forbs out there. You don't take them all out. Mowing actually increased the abundance of some of the species. The control and the other treatments are in between. But the thing I wanted to get to in this study is we followed it over time. We did these treatments because they were using sublethal rates of transline, and some of these other options wouldn't be optimal. So would you have to do them for multiple years to get activity? So we did those treatments 2004, 5, and also 6. So 3 years of doing the treatments, and then we stopped. And you can see at West Graham, this was a much more problematic grass-dominant site. The thistle started to come back with the herbicide treatments and some of the other management to try to improve waterfowl production or spot treating didn't work so well. And the populations were still there. But the thing that caught our attention was at Timberlake. This was a long-term problem child site, and Canada thistle had been managed for years and years there. We stopped the treatment. We had a big flush of control when we started the work, and the MOMO, we had populations that were elevated. The herbicides took them down fairly quickly, but as you kept monitoring the site, the thistle disappeared. And we had where we mowed in between the plots just to create alleys for access, we had a lot of bluegrass and all sorts of problems with the natives, but where the plots proper, they started to revert to more resilient prairies, regardless of what we're doing out there. And we've heard that anecdotally from several people. And we had at the same time a study going on at Lamberton. I won't go into these two, but we had a failure at Rosemont because thistle took over our plot, apropos of seedlings. We found some diseases out there when you have too much thistle, and the diseases actually took them out. So again, a severe thistle patch, in this case a monotypic stand over several acres, disappeared after about 6 years. At Lamberton, we did the same study that failed at Rosemount, just basically using a nice diverse mix of species, forbs, cool and warm season native grasses and forbs, cool only species, forbs and grasses, warm only, and then we planted Canada thistle in the middle of those little blocks. And we kept the thistle out otherwise, so we had thistle in each plot. We did those plots at 3 different planting dates, and frost seeding in the fall, seeding when you could get in the spring, and seeding in the summer. We repeated those 4 reps, and we repeated the whole thing in time. And this is just an image of the plot with the Canada thistle and actually planted in the center after we did management before putting the trial out to keep them out. So you can see the kind of thistle populations we were getting at the same time that we started the prairie. And a couple years in, it looked like there were big differences to talk about. The warm-only plots, if you've worked with those, they're slow to establish, and there was a lot of thistle for the first few years. In where we had the mix of cool and warm season natives, there were just a few Canada thistle out there, and we used transline in this plot right on the first fall after establishment. Cool only also was pretty competitive with just a few thistle. The regular mixture was not as bad as the warm season, but still had some thistle in it. And if you look at the data, early on it looked like, well, yes, the mix does matter, and the kind of control that we do with the mix early on does matter. Warm season was really problematic. Cool season looked pretty good. Took transline, took it out right away. So this is telling us something, and we thought we were starting to learn something. But if you look at the different seeding dates, fall 2004 was just a disaster. Thistle took over all the plots. So let's do that again. We repeated in the fall, and is one of our lowest plots. The point is climate matters. We're doing a few studies, and we see something that we think is showing us a trend, but the weather was probably the dominant factor. And if you look at the factorial of this with the different kinds of mixtures and the times of planting in fall, summer, and spring over the years, there's a few things that show up. Cool seasons did keep them out, but we're not trying to establish cool season prairies. and they also tended to turn into brome grass stands after a few years. Transline takes it out early. The thing that was really interesting, though, is we followed these studies over time, and this happens to show the fall treatment, the fall, spring, and summer seedings at the very beginning of the study, and then the year age of stand. We just followed them over time. Remember that fall 2004 was a super high population of Canada thistle. We did our studies, we did our treatments early on, but look at year 8. We're running out of thistle no matter what we did. Looking at the kinds of mixtures, cool only, warm only. Remember the warm only had the highest levels of Canada thistle early. If you put transline out there the first fall, you took it out right away in year 2 and kept the levels low. All the other treatments were kind of bouncing around, but again, over time, by year 7, going into year 8, we're running out of Canada thistle no matter what we did out there. And what's going on is, when you seed these plots, particularly with the warm season, this is the warm only mixture, there's just a lot of openness there. And if thistle are there, we planted the seeds. They took advantage of this open niche where there's bare ground and just not a lot of vegetative competition. So the more that you had, the more Canada thistle you had coming in. And over time, we see this time and time again in a lot of our prairie work. You go into a study by year 3, the seedlings are starting, thistle's starting to entrench, you're getting a perennial root system. By year 3 and 4, there's a lot of Canada thistle out there, and that's when people are complaining, and people go out and start to do herbicides or mowing or other things, which in and of themselves are a disturbance to the system. And in some cases, that might, like Timberlake, we think they were repeating that cycle by going in every 3 or 4 years and starting to manage this, that disrupted the forbs that were there and giving some problems later. And note these few plants that are left as the study wears on, they're small, they don't produce seeds, they're little vegetative plants that are about 6 to 12 inches tall, and they're really non-consequential. You wouldn't even see them in the mix if you didn't go out there and look for them. So to summarize that, with Canada thistle, whatever you do, you need to do it more than once if you're trying to actively manage it. For seeding prairies, it depends on the climate, and I won't go into it, but I kind of go back to some agronomic forage establishment work to get a read on when to seed. Functional mix does matter. The good diversity of warm and cool season species with cools to fill up the open niches early on, and transitioning to warm is probably the best kind of mix to use. But time and time again, and people that manage prairies have told us this, you see 3 to 4 years, there's a lot of thistle out there, and it looks very bad, and that's where people's neighbors start to complain and things start to happen. But if the prairie is a resilient prairie with the right mix and for the soil and the locale, the right species are there, with time, give it 5 to 7 years, and after that, it should look a lot different and be okay. So I just want to thank a lot of people that helped on this study, as well as just open it up to questions or from the group. A lot of material, again, some of that's just as background that you can go back and look at the slides and on your own time and try to get a little more information out of it.
Yeah, we should have the video up pretty quick so people can, you can watch the video on pause when you see a slide that you'd like to revisit. So we did have a couple questions. It looks like one got answered, but it was a clarifying question. When you were studying the tolerance of the various native forbs to milestone, that was in the context of broadcast application. Is that correct?
Yes, it was broadcast applications. Actually, in that work at Timberlake and West Graham, one of our first trials, that spot treatment, where in this case they were using a handgun, it actually, if you're hitting some forbs right around it, you're generally putting on a higher rate, just the way spot treatments work, and possibly see some more damage locally, but you're skipping other plants and freeing them. But most of that work was a broadcast application. And depending on the scale of the site and the timing, spot treatments can be an opportunity. Just to minimize.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Between the two DNR sites, you noted that one, when it had the 2 mowing treatments in a year, there was a massive kind of boom in the seedling population, but the other one, you didn't see that. And someone was wondering if you could go into more in depth why at the second site you did not see the kind of the bounce back of the thistles.
Yeah, that's a good question. The West Graham site, I didn't show for time standpoint. The biomass is much more grass dominant stand, and it had a little bit of an underpinning of patchy brome grass, and the dominant forb was Canada goldenrod. It just wasn't as resilient of a prairie, and I think especially to me it was interesting, the thistle thrived most where the warm season grasses were. Even with heavy thatch layer, the thistle was coming through there, and it was probably twice the population when we went in than the Timberlake site. So that site had a lot of a root system well established, and I think we just kept releasing the competition by mowing, taking out the higher layers, and the plants were just using that carbohydrate to produce extra shoots. You release apical dominance and you get a flush of shoots in an attempt for that plant to make up for the photosynthetic structure that was removed. Timberlake, there was a much higher forb, that third, and then a third of some of the grasses we didn't want, but there was quite a few forbs, depending on the forb, that would come in and help compete with Canada thistle. It could just be other reasons that weren't able to capture in the study, but in those other trials, I guess there's 4 sites, we had mowing treatments in there, and we saw that same phenomena. If the root system is established and you don't do something to really knock it back, you remove the apical dominance, you get an increase in the shoots expressing. That doesn't mean you've made a more severe problem. You might be depleting the carbohydrates if you did it a longer period of time. So you don't know where that's going, but it's not uncommon to see an increased number of shoots by simply mowing. For some of our managers, that's enough to keep you don't see the papai, you don't see the seed heads out there, your neighbors don't complain as much, and you can bide time for the first few years of that prairie to get to where you don't have the thistle expressing so much.
Were native forb diversity, or the native forb richness, was it measured in populations that had a high initial Canada thistle population in the first 1 to 3 years of establishment? I guess in other words, is there a threshold of thistle that reduces forb establishment?
That was I just showed a couple slides at the Rath site, which was a new seeding. It was a high productivity cornfield actually, so it had good soil fertility, good water holding capacity, but not excessive, and it was one of the prettiest prairie early establishers I've ever seen. It also was probably a lot of nitrogen for thistle to go to town on. So that was a site where we put out transects, and with Paul Bockenstead did some more exhaustive sampling. And the first crank of that, we only had up to 10% Canada thistle in the transects, and we couldn't sort any of that forb versus thistle thing out. And they went in and had a farmer harvest hay off of that. They did it in September, and we had that flush of shoots the next year then. But we also had a better view of the prairie to put transects out. We forced them into some populations that were high. And that's where we got the sense that it was about that 20 to 30% Canada thistle where you started to see a significant drop in native forbs. We don't know if one displaced the other or if Canada thistle just moved into those sites because the forbs weren't there. But the take-home message was that the forbs and the thistle are the two that are trading places in that prairie mix. The grasses kind of do their thing, regardless of the Canada thistle moving in and out of the system. But does one displace the other? I don't know. I would guess that if you had a really good forb mixture, particularly forbs that come in early, some of the cool, early establishing, early flowering forbs in the mix as well, you would have less of the Canada thistle problem moving in. But that's just conjecture on my behalf.
Mm-hmm. Where's your research published, Roger?
That's a good point. We got to get it published, so we have all this data piled up. I do too much extension work, so I do need to get it published. And I apologize for not getting that out. At some point, we might just put it up online just to get the information out. But we don't have most of this in journals yet. We're starting to deal with the data piles now, and that's my own challenge.
All right, well, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. And thank you especially to Roger again for just taking the time to put this presentation together for us. I will leave you with some contact information just for MIPN if you'd like to get back in touch with us. And otherwise, I will sign off here and you can go at your leisure. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.